Chapter 14, The Roaring Twenties. Part 2, America's Moral Compass Begins to Spin. Part 1, Traditionalist America does not warm up to this new culture. The onset of a deep rural depression in the early 1920s. It must be noted that although the 1920s is regarded as the materialist age of the radio, the automobile, the home appliances, etc., that made American life so rich, these riches were concentrated largely in urban and to a lesser extent in small-town America. They were largely lacking on the farms of rural America, where generally electricity had not yet reached. But that was the least of the problems of rural America during the 1920s. From the onset of the Great War in Europe in 1914, the demand for American farm goods skyrocketed as European farmers were taken away from their fields and put into uniform to fight in the trenches. Prices for American farm goods rose accordingly, and the American farmer found himself to be something of a very successful businessman. Life was full of promise on the American farm. So the farmer mortgaged his home and farm to buy more land and machinery to work the land in order to greatly expand his business. The profits rolled in while the war lasted. Farm failures. When the Great War ended in late 1918, the good times of the American farmer ended as well. With European soldiers returning to their farms, Europe no longer needed American farm products, at least not in anywhere near the quantity that it needed during the war. But the Americans had greatly expanded their operations, and now a glut in the agricultural market appeared, and agricultural products prices dropped away to nothing. Thus, for example, wheat prices in 1919 were $2.15 a bushel. The farmers were doing very well. But by the fall of 1920, the price had fallen to $1.44 a bushel, and by 1922, the price was down to 88 cents a bushel. Indeed, in his sales, the American farmer hardly recovered the cost of producing his products, much less make a profit or income for him and his family. But even worse, he owed huge amounts of money to the local banks that had lent him the money to buy additional land and machinery during the war, and he now had no way to pay back those loans or mortgages. One by one, farmers lost their land to the banks. Rural bank failures. But the banks were not in the business of farming. Instead of money returning to them as payments for the loans and mortgages, the banks received in default the title to these failed farms. To recover their money, they could sell these farms, but to whom? And when they did, it was always for far less than the money they had originally invested in the mortgages and the loans to the farmers. So it was that the farmers' troubles were now simply passed on to the banks. So the rural banks began by 1920 also to fail one by one. Deep misery set in on rural America. The growing American rural-urban cultural divide. And to further deepen the misery, watching the wealth and fun gravitate to urban America in the 1920s only made spirits worse in rural America. This economic divide, unfortunately, also happened to coincide with a growing cultural divide between rural and urban America. The rural side of this cultural divide was well founded on the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or WASP, population and ethic that had been at the core of American culture since the nation's founding in the early 1600s as a group of English colonies. On the urban side of the divide was a smaller but growing ethic of immigrant cultures, Catholic, Jewish, and secular socialist, accompanying recently arriving immigrants from Europe, joined by blacks migrating to the northern cities from the rural American South. By the 1920s, the WASPs, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, felt out of place in the American city, foreigners in their own land. While the American countryside felt most comfortable and consoled themselves with tradition, the cities were bubbling with a sense of change. This sense of change, of new possibilities, is what also brought waspish intellectual idealists to the cities, where they felt that they had greater freedom to explore social ideas that were considerably largely taboo in the traditional countryside that they had been born and grew up in. A rather condescending attitude towards backward, or at least unprogressive rural America began to register itself among these liberated intellectuals, adding considerably to the growing American cultural divide. Prohibition. Then there was this matter of the issue of the prevention or prohibition of the drinking of alcoholic beverages, an issue that divided America deeply. Perhaps most galling to rural America were the proliferation in urban America of the speakeasies, that is, illegal bars, operating in brazen defiance of the new 18th Amendment to the Constitution outlawing alcoholic beverages. Waspish rural and small-town America, especially the feminine portion of it, had actually for quite some time taken up arms against one of the great sins of men, the excessive drinking of alcoholic beverages. Waspish Christian morality had always been negative about alcohol, especially its easy ability to lead to drunkenness and alcoholism, which were most definitely great sins. But immigrants coming from Europe, Irish, Germans, Italians, Polish, etc., seemed not to have this anti-alcohol ethic, alcohol being part of their daily diet. These immigrants, for the most part, upon their arrival, were consigned to urban or industrial slums, farmland no longer being free for the taking from the Indians, because the frontier had finally closed with the last Indian lands claimed by white frontiersmen, farmers, in the late 1800s. These new immigrants were forced to find jobs in mines and factories, where there was a great need for unskilled labor. But working conditions were terrible, the wages minimal, and life, to quote Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. Men looked forward to payday when they could stop at the corner tavern on their way home from work and drown their sorrows in the bliss of alcohol. Their wives, of course, were upset that, with things as troubled as they were, to have that money go to a drunken spree was heartbreaking. The whole scenario was one of deep tragedy. Thus it was that the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was formed in order to combat this social disgrace. The WCTU certainly fit the profile of the progressive movement as one of its main branches of social reform, but it also carried undertones of other political forces working in American society. One of these was the women's suffragist movement and the women's demand to have their own voices heard in American politics. The other was the growing irritation of waspish rural America about the indecent lifestyle of urban industrial America, where the problem seemed to be largely located. Temperance, that is moderation, easily turned into total prohibition as the best solution to the problem. And so a movement began to actually place this reform of total prohibition of the drinking of alcohol in the Constitution as one of its amendments. And indeed, in early 1919, prohibition took effect as the 18th Amendment. Urban resistance to prohibition. But urban industrial culture did not take well to this imposed reform. It was understood, probably correctly, as simply a slap in the face of urban America by rural America, and urban America decided to strike back with a loud and very visible defiance of this law. Indeed, the culture that Prohibition was aimed at, urban America, seemed to actually increase its alcoholic consumption behind the closed doors of the speakeasy bars, which everyone, including the police, knew about quite readily. The fast, easy money to be earned by the sale of illegal liquor and other social services naturally led to the growth of large, wealthy, and very violent social structures, the mob, constructed heavily along the lines of the Italian, actually Sicilian, mafia, though the Irish and others had their versions of the mob. Police and judges were paid to look the other way, and in general, urban America turned into an even greater affront to the moral sensitivities of waspish America. And the cities loved the pained outcries of rural America. Prohibition had become the gauntlet thrown down in the growing urban-rural cultural divide impacting the nation. American xenophobia. Along similar lines, immigrants in general became a target of traditionalist America after the war, being by this time mostly, one, ethnically, Southern and Eastern European, two, religiously, Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, three, politically, often sympathetic to one or another of the disgruntled European workers' movements of socialism, communism, or even anarchism. The Great Red Scare in America. Relating closely to this mood of xenophobia was the huge Red Scare that captured the imaginations of Americans, urban as well as rural, after the war, and into the first part of the 1920s. This was not without cause, however. Not only was this fear inspired by the spectacle of European societies caught up in class warfare, inspired by a spreading communist urge of an angry European working class, but also by the equally aggressive spirit of anarchism, the close cousin of communism. But a similar agitation seemed to be brewing in America. From Southern Italy came a large number of followers of the Italian anarchist Luigi Galliani, who brought with him their radical political instincts. Numerous package bombs mailed to important American political and economic leaders were intercepted before they could do their horrible damage. This naturally put America on edge. At the forefront of the movement to stop such radical violence was Wilson's Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Although he started out cautiously in his campaign against foreign agitators, he turned savagely against immigrants suspected of radical views after his home was blown up, along with the bomber himself, a Gallianist, Carlo Bandonici. Palmer hired 24-year-old J. Edgar Hoover to gather evidence and lead raids against such radicals. Files were gathered on 60,000 people, and thousands were actually arrested in the period between November 1919 and February 1920. However, his plans for a presidential bid, his activity was making him indeed a popular public figure, crumbled when a major red uprising he predicted for May the 1st, 1920, failed to materialize. Footnote: May Day had long been the chief holiday of the socialist labor movement in Europe. Then, on September 16th, 1920, a massive bomb exploded in the busy street in front of the Wall Street offices of the J.P. Morgan Bank, killing 30 people and injuring 150 others, 8 of whom would also die of their wounds. Although there was no precise evidence identifying the perpetrator of this vile event, suspicions were directed towards an Italian Gallianist anarchist, Mario Buda, verified as indeed the culprit 35 years later by a fellow anarchist and by Buda's nephew, who soon returned to Naples and thus was never apprehended. Americans were shocked. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Another event was to rock the nation, not just in 1920 when the event occurred, but over the next 7 years as the nation, and even the world, debated the event and the way it was handled by the American justice system. On April 15, 1920, robbers held up and killed one of the two men transporting the company payroll of the Slater Morrill Shoe Company in Braintree, Massachusetts. Suspicions immediately went to a group of local Gallienist anarchists, of whom Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested and charged with the crime. The only real evidence to work with were the casings of bullets used in the attack. Testimonies by witnesses were confused, and claims were made that the police had manipulated the evidence. Also, there was a rush to judgment by the presiding judge, which later would become a major point of those who claimed that the two men were unfairly tried and sentenced for the murder the following summer, July of 1921. Almost immediately, the court case became something of the court case of the century. Writers, academics, and even artists got into the act, protesting the probable innocence of the two Italians, citing the growing xenophobia, that is, the fear or hatred of foreigners, of Americans, as the only driving force behind the conviction. For the next 6 years, the case was debated widely as the case was appealed through the American court system. Even the world got in on the act. Americans were widely understood to be cowboys when it came to justice, and the assumption arose that this was all nothing more than a typical vigilante lynching for which Americans were famous. Even the Pope intervened on Sacco and Vanzetti's behalf, asking the Americans to check their motives. Then, when finally in 1927 the sentence of death was finally issued for the two accused, protests, even riots, broke out in a number of the world's major cities. Nonetheless, in August of 1927, the two were put to death in the electric chair. Footnote. The case continued, however, to draw the interest of journalists, artists, and political activists over the decades that followed. In 1977, the liberal Massachusetts governor, Michael Dukakis, issued a formal proclamation that the case had been mistried and that Sacco and Vanzetti's names should be cleared of the crime. However, subsequent statements, even as recently as 2005, by Italian colleagues of both men, made it fairly clear that Sacco had indeed done the shooting and Vanzetti had been involved only in the robbery portion of the event. The Scopes Monkey Trial, Dayton, Tennessee, 1925. But undoubtedly, the most dramatic confrontation of the decade between the two cultures occurred over the issue of the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution in the public schools. In 1925, the two sides, liberal urban America and conservative rural America, met for something of a showdown in Dayton, Tennessee, over the question of teaching Darwinism in the Tennessee's public schools. The battle was over the fundamental question: was man descended, as Darwin stated, through the evolutionary process of natural selection and his survival of the fittest, from some early version of a primate or monkey? Or was he, as the Bible states, created fully as man by God in a single event? The event came to pass when in May of 1925 a group of Dayton civic leaders met at F.E. Robinson's drugstore and decided to challenge Tennessee's new statute against the teaching of Darwinist evolution. One motivation for holding the trial in Dayton was to revive the town's flagging economy. They knew that this would somehow put Dayton on everyone's map, and indeed it did. The mastermind behind the event was George Washington Ripley, an engineer and geologist who managed the Cumberland Coal and Iron Company. Ripley was widely credited with suggesting that Dayton challenged the new anti-evolution statute. Cooperating in this venture was the 24-year-old John Thomas Scopes. He was teaching at the local high school, his first job after graduating from the University of Kentucky in 1924. He taught algebra and physics, served as athletic coach, and occasionally substituted in biology classes at the Rhea County High School. The idea was that he would teach Darwinist biology at least once, in violation of the state's law prohibiting the teaching of Darwinism. This act would then set up the opportunity for the legal world in Tennessee to decide whether such a law was indeed constitutional. During the extremely hot summer of 1925, the Scopes monkey trial riveted the attention of the nation as newspapermen from all around the country crowded into the steaming courthouse to follow the trial. The old warhorse, William Jennings Bryan, who had run unsuccessfully 3 times for the U.S. presidency at the head of the Democratic Party ticket, represented waspish America with its fervent dislike of Darwinism. Unfortunately, the old warhorse was running on his last legs, for he would die from exhaustion the week after the verdict was announced in this hallmark trial. Representing the Darwinists was Clarence Darrow, the celebrity New York lawyer who had dazzled the nation with his clever defense of 2 society boys who had killed a young 14-year-old neighbor in order to see what it would be like to commit the ultimate crime and to prove their Darwinian superiority. Darrow blamed their actions on the extravagantly wealthy socioeconomic circumstances that had distorted their moral sensitivity. Darrow also represented the fast-rising urban secular culture, which ridiculed the superstition of the traditional culture. Backing up Darrow was the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, which was to become the leading voice behind a movement to replace waspish Christianity with secular humanism as America's cultural religious underpinning. Which side actually won the 1925 contest depended on the natural sympathies of the person giving answer to the question. From pulpits, anti-Darwinism seemed vindicated by the fact that the judge decided to support the law prohibiting the teaching of Darwinism in the Tennessee public schools. But the up east urban newspapers celebrated the quite obvious to them anyway, intellectual victory of the scientific Darwinists over the superstitious backwoods fantasies of the anti-Darwinists. Ultimately, the case itself decided nothing, but certainly it clarified the waspish and anti-waspish split in American culture. Christian fundamentalism versus Christian liberalism. This deep urban-rural cultural divide also registered itself as the deepening split within the Christian community itself, especially among the very socially and politically prominent Presbyterians. There were a number of issues that were behind the split, though one, biblical inerrancy, was definitely the most important. Almost everything else about the liberal fundamentalist split followed from the issue of biblical inerrancy. Was every word in the Bible literally true, or were certain parts to be understood as merely symbolic or suggestive of truth? For instance, exactly how literally was a Christian to take the miracle stories such as the virgin birth of Jesus, his walking on water, even his bodily resurrection? Liberals interpreted these as merely subjective beliefs of the very early Christian community, pointing to the powerful nature of belief. The events themselves were not to be understood as necessarily factually true events. Fundamentalists strongly opposed that view, claiming that every event described was to be understood as to even be scientifically true. Actually, the split was simply a continuation of the division with American Christian culture that reached back to the Enlightenment of the late 1600s and the Great Awakening of the early 1700s. It had revived itself again in the late 1800s over the issue of higher criticism of Scripture. The Presbyterian scholar Charles Briggs published reviews of Scripture challenging the reputed authorship of a number of the books of the Old Testament, claiming even that the Old Testament was morally inferior to the moral development of modern times. So outraged was the Presbyterian denomination that it blocked Briggs's professorial appointment to the faculty of the Union Seminary in New York City. But the seminary refused to dismiss Briggs and instead withdrew from the Presbyterian denomination. In the early 1900s, the question of biblical inerrancy gathered force as a divisive issue, first within the Presbyterian denomination and then soon with other mainline denominations. Heresy trials abounded as theologians and pastors lined up on one side or the other of the issue. For a time, the Presbyterian denomination favored the conservative view, demanding that all pastors adhere to 5 basic doctrines in order for their ordination to be in good standing with the denomination. But liberals or modernists were gathering strength within the denomination, and with the unification of the Cumberland Presbyterian denomination, the Presbyterian Church shifted strongly towards the liberal side of the debate. Meanwhile, Presbyterian laymen Lyman Stewart sponsored a new series of publications entitled The Fundamentals, published between 1910 and 1915. This would become a rallying point for a number of conservative theologians of a wide number of Christian denominations. In 1915, the conservative journal, The Presbyterian, finally published a declaration entitled Back to Fundamentals, and thus the fundamentalist was brought into greater use to describe conservative Christian theology. At the same time, the liberal side of Christianity was taking a broader, conservatives claimed shallower, approach to the faith, admitting that there was more than one road to God, that God's love extended to the saved and unsaved alike, and that Christians ought to be more ecumenical among themselves, ignoring doctrinal differences among Christians of all types, and more accommodating in their outreach to other cultures. The gauntlet was thrown down in 1922 when the liberal preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick presented a sermon at the First Presbyterian Church of New York City entitled, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? So incensed was the General Assembly, sort of a Presbyterian Congress, at what it considered an attack on the fundamentals of the faith that it considered removing Fosdick from the pulpit. He was defended by the New York lawyer John Foster Dulles, who would serve as America's Secretary of State during the Eisenhower presidency in the 1950s. But Fosdick instead simply resigned his position. John D. Rockefeller would select Fosdick to pastor the prestigious Riverside Church, which he personally had funded. On the other hand, one of the foremost of the believers in Christian fundamentals, and thus a major opponent of Christian liberalism, was J. Gresham Machen, the New Testament professor at Princeton Seminary. Among the several books he published was Christianity and Liberalism, 1923, in which he claimed that the Christian liberalism was not even Christianity, but some other religion. He was distressed that Christian liberals believed, like Unitarians, that Christ was not a personal Savior, but instead a personal teacher, setting moral examples which all, Christian and non-Christian, ought to follow. And liberalism tended to view Christianity as simply one of the many ways that led to the fatherhood of God. But the liberal-conservative balance of power was shifting within the Presbyterian denomination during the 1920s. When, in 1928, the Presbyterian General Assembly voted to move Princeton from a traditionally conservative theology to a more liberal position, Machen and 2 other Princeton professors withdrew from the seminary to start a new one in nearby Philadelphia, that is, Westminster Seminary. Section 3. However, even in urban America, a strong sense of cynicism afflicts the roar of the Roaring Twenties. Actually, all this fascination with the exciting world of massive materialism and unlimited personal freedom seemed at times, even to urban America, to exist simply to cover over a darker suspicion about life, a suspicion that lurked just below the surface of all this hoopla. The Great War and its inevitable outcome of nothingness had shaken the moral foundations of the American nation, as it did with every other participating nation, to the very core of what the society understood as being right and wrong. A form of cultural cynicism set in following the collapse of the Wilsonian dream in America. Many Americans and Europeans took the attitude that you'd better enjoy life while you had it. Eat, drink, and be merry today because tomorrow you may die. Further, be wary of the high idealism of those who want to invite you into some kind of a higher world. Their world is only a fiction. The only world that truly exists or matters is the one immediately in front of you. Such an attitude was considered being truly realistic and sophisticated. In keeping with this mood of rampant cynicism, the general understanding was that there were no rights and wrongs, only just human impulses that people needed to be socially free to follow out. Whether these impulses were right or wrong, unless they were obviously self-destructive, was a matter that no one was supposed to be in a position to judge, either of themselves or others. Thus, free-thinking artists and intellectuals boasted of their escape from the intellectual tyrannies of excessive patriotism and superstitious piety. They proudly professed belief in nothing except the immediacy of their own personal existence, and were quick to mock those who held higher ideals, whether founded on the past or the future. Philosophically, they refer to themselves sometimes as humanists, sometimes as existentialists, but always as scientific. But actually as pure secularists, believing only in the reality of the immediately surrounding material order, they tended to be simply hedonistic cynics. They supported no causes, nor did they pay much attention to the social requirements of the larger social order. Those expected to lead the post-war societies got little or no support from this self-indulgent social group. The lost generation. Thus it was that despite all this freedom, despite the material glitz and glamour of the 1920s, there was beneath it all a spiritual emptiness, one that led Gertrude Stein, the grand patroness of the large number of authors and poets who gathered in Paris to seek for meaning into life, to call her literary flock gathered there the lost generation. This group included such Americans as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, E. Cummings, and Dorothy Parker. The pointless brutality of the war had stolen from this generation the optimism that had characterized Western culture during the Progressivist era. True, the material level that the people were able to live at was unparalleled in history. But this now seemed to be very small comfort to these intellectuals who felt the necessity to plumb the depths of the human soul for some kind of new direction that would be worthy of the kind of commitment to life that they had felt before the war. But mostly, they found no such direction or worth. The cynics. The spirit of these lost souls was summed up in such works as Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, 1926, and Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise, 1920, The Beautiful and the Damned, 1922, and The Great Gatsby, 1925. This last mentioned novel is highly representative of this Jazz Age mood. Behind all the wealth, the fast life, the visible material achievements, was a spiritual emptiness and social confusion that results in the murder or suicide of the gifted but corrupt young Gatsby and the collapse of the small social group that had once surrounded the great Gatsby. Likewise, Hemingway's novels seem to turn on the issue of hopes that lead nowhere because of life's complex, countering circumstances that the human will seems unable to overcome. The Reds. Meanwhile, other intellectuals, repulsed by the failure of American progressivism to deliver on its promises, turned to other philosophies in the hope that they might find something more substantial to build their social hopes on. Marxism proved to be particularly popular, as the news coming out of Red Communist Russia, tainted by careful manipulation by the communists themselves, seemed to be working quite well once the Russian Civil War was over and Lenin's communists had full mastery over the Russian situation, moving the country from feudal backwardness into something quite modern and quite humane because it was supposedly so very communal. To a group of socially empty intellectual Westerners, this certainly was bound to have a very, very strong appeal. Freudian psychology explains and justifies the American mood. Then there was the degree of comforting logic that seemingly could be found in the psychological theories of the Austrian doctor Sigmund Freud. Though none of his theories were derived through the exacting rigors of the scientific method by which the rest of science accepted or rejected new truths, Freud's theories went unquestioned in much of urban America, and in fact were widely accepted as absolute truth because they made sense when little else did. That is to say, Freud's speculations about the motives and behaviors of humans seemed to offer an explanation to a culture, to a lifestyle, to a worldview that otherwise seemed shallow and mindless and beneath the dignity of human reason. Freud revised some element of hope that what the post-war, post-Christian culture was doing was actually logical. Basically, Freud explained that we humans did things that made no sense because we were driven by even deeper, unexplained urges that ran below the level of what our conscious minds were capable of understanding and directing our actions in a logical manner. Freud speculated these subconscious urges were formed in our early childhood out of sexual urges that had to be repressed in order to form us into reasonably well-functioning social creatures, that is, responsible members of society. Freud held to the idea that by going back in our earliest memories and revisiting the events of our early childhood that were part of this repressive experience, we might be freed from such repression and find indeed fuller, more rewarding lives socially than the ones we were typically experiencing during the Roaring Twenties. Freud mocked the idea of there being any ultimate truths that directed human existence, only socially useful ideas by which we humans were indoctrinated into society. Religion was chief among these socially useful ideas. Religion in itself could not be said to be true, for in exploring the many religious beliefs around the world, it became clear to Freud, and most other intellectuals of those days, that the truths of religion were simply cultural explanations offered as comfort, such as Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, to societies trying to make logical sense of an existence that otherwise had no particular logic to it. In short, to Freud, religion was a neurosis, or a useful illusion we fed ourselves in order to comfort ourselves in the face of a very difficult existence. To Freud and to the hundreds of thousands of hip, that is, cool, Freudian followers that believed Freud to be the supreme prophet of modern times, religion in itself was completely unrelated to truth, and indeed was the source of some of the most illogical and cruel of human acts in history. Footnote. Certainly to the followers of Freud, the experience of the recent Great War exposed such dangerous religious folly, in that each of the contending parties in the war claimed Gott mit uns, God is with us. Surely God was with no one during the war, unless God was indeed some kind of cruel monster delighting in watching God-fearing soldiers slaughter other God-fearing soldiers in vast numbers. However, the followers of Freud failed to observe that the fact that Freudian psychology itself was valued so highly by them only because it made sense, which thus put Freudianism in the same category as the religions Freud mocked because they could be said to be true only because they too made sense to their religious followers. Freud himself made it clear that just because something made sense did not make it true. It merely made it socially useful. And thus it was that Freudian followers followed Freud religiously. Indeed, in all this, Freud and his Freudian followers were hoping to construct a new cultural truth, contributing greatly to a new post-Christian religion within Western society, the secular humanism that was sweeping the intellectual circles of Europe and America.